You're tuned into NuSound Radio 92 FM, and today we're bringing you a brand new show called A Reasonable Conversation. This is hosted by myself, Prerna, and Satish.
Hi, Prerna.
We're also joined in the studio with Vivek, and we'll be with you every Sunday from 12 to 1 discussing important topics with various guests, but ensuring that all conversations are reasonable and backed up with reasonable arguments. Isn't that right, guys?
Yeah, we're going to do our best.
And this is going to be a common theme running through all our shows, that everything is reasonable. And today's topic of conversation is going to be about the caste system. Now, if you have any comments, text us on 07961 387 787 or tweet NuSound 92 FM, and that's new NU.
If there was one subject which had to have a reasonable approach to it, it's got to be the caste system. And all the discussions have been going on in Parliament, been going on in our communities. One of the things that's noticeable is that reason seems to be disappearing into the background.
Definitely.
Today, I think what we're going to do is to bring a bit of reason back into the whole discussion, and really to explore reason as well. Caste couldn't be, there couldn't be a better subject than caste.
Definitely not. There's so many myths that surround the caste system and what it's all about, so it's good to actually get it all out in the open and kind of say it as it is.
I think there's a lot of emotion as well attached to the idea of caste, and there's a lot of feelings stuck in there, so yeah, I think being reasonable is really important when talking about things like caste. It should be good fun.
We've mentioned the word reason a few times. I don't know whether you guys share this, but I've been studying what's happened to this whole caste dialogue, and it's one thing that's really struck out is that a lot of people have got quite a few ideas about it, but very few have actually stepped back and then decided to work through and said, well, is this reasonable? Is what I believe reasonable? Is what I'm hearing reasonable? And so we're going to open up all of those little cans of worms today, and we're going to try and delve in and see whether we can end up with a reasonable conclusion.
Definitely, and I think, especially with the caste system, many of us just are told, we kind of believe what our parents have told us or what we hear from other people. We haven't actually looked into it ourselves and kind of studied why the caste system's there, what it actually is.
Yeah, I think you, youngsters certainly, haven't really had a need to have a look at this at all. A lot of the older members of our communities have come from a time and a place in India where caste was actually quite an important part of the background scenario. Whereas here, you've all grown up, and caste has never really been on the horizon until recently, when Lord Harris stood up in the House of Lords and made his announcement that in this country, 1 in 2 Hindus is perpetrating caste prejudice against the other Hindus. It really sort of made me stand up and listen to what was going on. I'd never come across it, and so the whole debate dragged me into it. And so I've spent quite a bit of time doing some research on this, and it'd be great to hear what Vivek, you as and yourself, Prerna, as members of the younger Indians in this country, have got to say on the subject as well.
Definitely. So what's this bill about? What exactly does it say? Well,
it's an amendment to the equalities legislation. It was a bit of a surprise. Nobody was really expecting this subject to be raised, but earlier in the year, Lord Harris stood up in the House of Lords and asked for the government to debate and include the word caste into legislation as one of the protected characteristics of equalities legislation. So you're not allowed to be prejudiced against somebody on the basis of their sex, their gender, their religion, etc. And they wanted to add in to that list of characteristics the word caste. It was an extraordinary debate. In fact, this was what brought me into this whole arena of caste and politics. I was having a quiet life out in Berkshire when suddenly I heard that 1 in 2 Hindus is perpetrating prejudice against the other half. And so I decided to have a look at it in a bit more detail.
Oh, brilliant.
Just out of curiosity, how did they explain what caste meant? Did they? Or did they just include the word caste? What does it actually mean?
Okay, well, this is where our first casualty of reason sort of appeared on the horizon. Being a reasonable person, I'm sure our listeners are going to agree. Before you put a word into legislation, we tend to expect that our legislators are going to define what the words mean. That's what we do in normal life.
Especially in the legal world as well, everything has a definition, and you've got to get your definition to a key.
Well, you'll be stunned that they actually did go ahead and include the word caste into legislation after 4 debates, and then it was passed as legislation, and now they're going through the process of trying to define what caste is. So
after having already added it.
After having already added it.
Wait, so they've had 4 debates, they've added it into legislation, and no one really knows what caste is.
Absolutely right. And not only that, they're spending taxpayers' money on now trying to work out what this word is that's been dumped into legislation.
So when they did actually do their research, it was with Hindus, Sikhs and Buddhists, so it wasn't just Hindu castes that were kind of looked at. And they did do some research and they found that there was a lot of discrimination, allegedly, that existed within the Sikh community. But when they made the legislation, this wasn't very clear. I mean, in the House of Lords debate, it wasn't mentioned at all.
Yeah, again, looking for reason in this whole journey has been a challenge. There was some research done. The government appointed a body called the NISA, National Institute for Educational and Social Research, I think it is. Mm-hmm. And this body was funded with a program. They spent a lot of money and they came up with a report. Okay. And this report is what Lord Harry's held in his hands as he stood there in the House of Lords and said 400,000 members of a particular Dalit community are being prejudiced and acted against in the UK. When we had a look at the report, it was quite stunning to find that actually that wasn't in the report at all.
No, it wasn't. It was just about Sikh Jats in various parts of the country discriminating against others.
Well, one of the things that we did discover when we started to have a look through the report was that there were, I think, 33 cases they looked at. Mm-hmm. And of the 33, there was only one which even had a Hindu connection.
Okay.
And yet, in the House of Lords, each of the Lords stood up, and one after the other, they mentioned Hindus, Hinduism, Hindus, Hinduism, Hindus, Hinduism, again and again.
So there's no evidence.
And there was no evidence in the report
that's
at
terrible.
all.
There was actually a video on YouTube, wasn't there? I think I saw something on YouTube with all these lords and politicians saying these things, and it was ridiculous. If they don't have evidence, the sort of stuff they were actually saying was pretty
defamatory.
Well, if it was said outside of the House of Lords, and I've had a few lawyers look at this, if it was said outside of the House of Lords, those actions and speaking those words would actually fall foul of the equalities legislation themselves. You know, it was only because they said them under the protection of parliamentary privilege that nobody could bring a legal action against them for inciting religious discrimination and hatred.
So the ones who made the legislation to protect equality and discrimination are the ones that are actually...
Well, they're all
carrying it out themselves.
It's quite surprising that they have to keep reminding themselves that they're all honourable people. You see, this is I'm sure that this is why they keep saying, "Well, the right honourable so and so." It's as a reminder rather than as a claim to a title or ability. Quite stunning.
Okay, so they made note. Well, they're trying to define caste. What's your understanding of what the caste is like? The caste system is, or the Varna system? Okay,
well, it's there's a little bit of history. Caste isn't a word that appears in anything to do with India and Hinduism or any of the Indian dharmic traditions at all. It's actually a Portuguese word.
Okay.
And so if you sort of wind the clock back to when the Europeans first stumbled into India, right, remember the mindset of the Europeans who came into India at that time. They were colonials, right? Mm-hmm. Not only colonials, but they were also from a civilization which was controlled by the church. Yeah, the Portuguese had a very strong church presence. The British were also, the social structure was very strongly dominated by the church. And so they were used to living in a place where the church and religious people were on the top, and then there were the kings, and then there were people who were traders, etc., etc. So that was their mindset as well. And it's probably also worth remembering that that's the sort of time when people had to leave Europe and go over to the States to set up a new society because they were actually limited in terms of how much social progression they themselves could do. There was such a rigid hierarchy in the European civilization at that time.
Definitely, I mean, there was a upper class, a lower class, working class, and something that people still think resonates in Britain today.
Absolutely.
So,
right.
Are you saying the introduction of the word caste into the Indian society had like an agenda behind it by the Europeans? Was it introduced on purpose? Or?
Well, it's a great question, and there is actually a body of evidence that says that that is what happened. It's a Portuguese word, and with the perspective of the Portuguese at that time, they looked at the Indian social structure, and they decided, hang on, we know what this is, and they actually imposed their understanding on what was a totally different structure. The Indian structure, traditionally, the Hindu structure, was always to do with Varna and Jatis, which are nothing to do with castes in the European sense.
So just to give our listeners who don't know what that is, what is Varna and Jati?
Okay, well, Varna is an extraordinary word. It actually means aptitude.
Okay.
According to our according to the Hindu religion, what it says is that when a person is born, they're actually born with a certain set of characteristics already, which are a carryover from previous lives.
So it's nothing to do with surname then?
Well, in the horoscope, you can actually have brothers who belong to different varans. So you would have a family where you've got one brother who, according to his aptitudes and according to what the Shastras say, he actually would be, if he's vigorous and tall and brave and courageous, this is what he's destined to be. They would actually allocate him to the Kshatriya Varan, the soldiers.
So it's got nothing to do with your family then?
It's got nothing to do with the lineage itself.
So how did this come about then? If you've got a certain surname, you belong to a certain, I don't know, caste of people?
Well, it's an extraordinary thing. If you do observe, if you study what happened, a lot of Hindus, very few of them actually studied the Shastras and what's written about their religion themselves.
Okay.
And it's very easy to then teach people what you want them to learn. So much of, there's a phrase that's now becoming quite popular amongst religious scholars who study Hinduism, and they're actually creating something called Neo-Hinduism.
Okay, what's that?
It's amazing. And what Neo-Hinduism is it's what the colonial powers defined as Hinduism and then started to teach the Indians that this is what you are. And there are just, that I think is really at the heart of many of the problems to do with this whole caste thing. The vocabulary, the dialogue, many of the concepts, they've all actually come from colonial ideas. And would you believe that there was a general census in the 1800s, I think it was 1871 when it was first done, and one of the British civil servants, he organised over 1,500 jatis, okay, which are occupations. He organised 1,500 of these into 4 strata.
Okay.
And he said the way that you can decide on which person should go into which strata is by measuring the width of the bridge of their nose.
Wow.
Okay, so we're talking about a reasonable conversation.
Okay,
So
that's not reasonable at all.
It seems fairly unreasonable to me. Can you imagine if we were to do that in the House of Lords, right? We'd be able to pick which of the Lords should actually be manual labourers, and perhaps which of the Lords should be engaged in more erudite activities.
Wow, so shocking.
Yeah, so they'd actually just measure what they look like, just like animals then, basically.
Absolutely.
And categorise them into categories that they decided?
That's right.
Oh, wow, okay.
So 1,500 jatis, which is occupational groupings, basically, right? It's not uncommon for people to gather together according to shared knowledge, shared understanding, shared aspirations. It's a perfectly natural human thing.
But it's just when you have children and they're put in the same sort of brackets, and that's when problems arise.
That's problem number one. I remember the Indian civilization goes back tens of thousands of years, right? And in that time, people learned that it's okay for people to gather according to their shared understandings, but what is not okay is to prevent somebody from moving from one group to another group. That's fundamentally flawed, isn't it? You can't force a child into following a path that is not naturally suited to him, to his temperament or anything else like that.
So all these myths that, if you're born into a Brahmin family, then you can be a priest, but someone who's not born into a Brahmin family can't be a priest. These are all myths that don't actually...
Yeah, and if you look at the Hindu texts themselves, they are so clear. There are so many texts. I mean, I would suspect that the main text that you would refer to these days for the... To say what a Hindu is and isn't, is the Bhagavad Gita, right? And in the Gita it says that everybody is born as a manual labourer.
Okay.
Right? And it's by your efforts that you evolve into what you can be. And so there is no requirement that what your birth is, that dictates what your social status is. And if you have a look at the list of Indian sages and saints and so on, there are so many who all come from what would traditionally be classed, or from the point of view of colonial people, who come from the lower castes, as they call them.
Oh, wow. Because I think Valmiki was
Valmiki, there are just so many. The Valmiki, the author of the Ramayana, is probably the best example, but there is a list, Sai Baba, right? How many Hindus worship the original Sai Baba? Yeah? And yet that original Sai Baba, he wasn't even a Hindu by birth.
Oh, okay. What was he by birth?
Oh, you've not heard the famous shlok that he spoke. And in this shlok, he said, I live in a mosque, right, but I'm no longer a Muslim.
Okay.
Right? I worship at fire, and yet I'm not a Hindu.
Okay.
Okay, so he was one of these enlightened sages who'd gone beyond religion.
Okay, man of no religion.
And all of those sorts of things. And he was openly happy to declare that actually I'm not this, I'm not that. But that didn't cause anybody a problem.